Jackson, Mississippi. Just past midnight, the 12th of June, 1963, a man pulls his car into his own driveway. He is carrying a stack of T-shirts printed with three words, "Jim Crow must go." He has just come from a meeting with the lawyers of the movement he leads. His wife and his three young children are awake inside, waiting up for him. He steps out of the car and a single rifle shot cracks across the still street. The bullet passes through his back and through his heart. He is 37 years old and he falls a few feet from his own front door. His name is Medgar Evers, and for years the men who wanted him dead had been trying. To understand why one man with a rifle could believe that killing Medgar Evers would change the course of a state, you have to go back to the beginning, to a small farm in the red dirt country of central Mississippi, and to a boy who learned very early what his world expected him to accept. He came into the world in the summer of 1925, and he would leave it murdered before he turned 38. A life of not quite 38 years that ran like a fault line through the middle of the American century. To understand the man, you have to start where he started, dirt poor, black and southern, in the state that was the hardest test of every promise the country had ever made about equality. He was born Medgar Wiley Evers on the 2nd of July, 1925, in Decatur, Mississippi, the third of 5 children of James and Jessie Evers. His older brother, Charles, would be his closest ally and shadow through the whole story, the two of them bound together by everything they saw growing up. His father worked a small farm and hauled logs at a local sawmill. The family was poor, hard-working, and proud. Medgar walked as far as 12 miles each way to attend the ramshackle segregated schools that were all the state provided for black children, and he earned his high school diploma the slow, stubborn way. Mississippi in those years was the hard center of the Jim Crow South, a place of separate schools, separate water fountains, separate everything, held in place by law, by custom, and where those failed, by terror. Everyday life in that Mississippi was a series of small, deliberate humiliations layered on top of real danger. There were separate schools and separate railway cars, separate windows at the store and separate doors at the courthouse, and a whole unwritten code that a black child was expected to learn young, whom to look at and whom not to, when to step off the sidewalk, how to answer and how never to answer. The Evers family was poor but proud, and Medgar's father, James, was known as a man who would not be made to grovel, a bearing that in that time and place was itself a quiet act of defiance and a dangerous one. There was a memory from his boyhood that he carried for the rest of his life. A family friend, a man named Willie Tingle, was accused of insulting a white woman. A white mob seized him, dragged him through the streets, and shot him to death, and his bloodied clothes were left hanging on a fence at the edge of town as a warning. Young Medgar had to walk past that fence on his way to school. No one was arrested. No one was tried. The lesson the killers meant to teach was that a black life in Mississippi could be ended without consequence, and Medgar Evers learned instead the opposite lesson, one that would eventually cost him everything, that a world built on that kind of fear had to be changed. In 1943, at 17, Medgar Evers left Mississippi in a United States Army uniform. He served in a segregated transportation corps unit, the 657th Port Company, and in the summer of 1944 he landed in Normandy in the weeks after D-Day and drove and loaded the trucks of the Red Ball Express, the lifeline of fuel and ammunition that kept the Allied armies moving across France. He fought for his country in a war against a racist tyranny abroad, and he did it in an army that segregated him by the color of his skin. In France, he was, for the first time in his life, treated by ordinary people as a man rather than a category. He did not forget it. He came home in 1946 with an honorable discharge and a settled conviction. As he put it to his brother Charles when they got out of the army, they were going to straighten this thing out. He tested that conviction almost immediately, and it nearly killed him. In 1946, home from the war, Medgar Evers and his brother Charles and a handful of other black veterans walked to the county courthouse in Decatur to do the simplest thing a citizen can do, to register and to vote. They had worn the country's uniform. They meant to claim the country's franchise. On Election Day, an armed white crowd blocked the courthouse door and turned them back. The message was blunt. The ballot was not for them, and the war they had fought had changed nothing at home. For most men, that would have been the end of it. For Evers, it was a beginning. He had seen in France what it looked like to be treated as a full human being, and he had come back to a state that met his uniform with a mob. From that day, the vote, who had it, who was kept from it, sat at the center of everything he would do. Back home, Evers enrolled at Alcorn Agricultural and Mechanical College, the state college for black students, where he studied business administration, ran track and played football, sang in the choir, debated, and was elected president of his junior class. There he married a classmate, Merle Beasley, on Christmas Eve of 1951. They would have 3 children, and she would become his full partner in everything that followed. He graduated in 1952, and he went to work selling insurance across the Mississippi Delta for Dr. T.R.M. Howard, a wealthy black entrepreneur and activist whose company was based in the all-black town of Mound Bayou. Driving that territory, insurance case by insurance case, Evers saw the full weight of the system up close: the crushing poverty, the sharecroppers trapped in debt, the fear that kept people from the ballot box, the everyday humiliations of segregation. He began organizing. He helped build the Regional Council of Negro Leadership and its boycotts, including a campaign against filling stations that denied black customers the use of their restrooms, spread through bumper stickers that read, "Don't buy gas where you can't use the restroom." The roadwork was an education in its own right. Case by case, farm by farm, Evers saw how the system actually held together. The sharecroppers kept in permanent debt to the landowner's store, the workers who could be fired for their name appearing on an NAACP list, the families who had learned that a complaint could bring a night visit. He saw, too, that the single thing the whole structure feared most was the vote, because the vote could unmake it from the inside. So he began quietly to organize, helping build the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, working its boycotts and printing up the bumper stickers that turned an insult into a slogan, "Don't buy gas where you can't use the restroom." In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated public schools were unconstitutional, and Evers decided to test it in the hardest place he knew. He applied to the law school of the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, as a black man. His application was denied. But the challenge marked him, and it brought him to the attention of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. On the 24th of November, 1954, the NAACP named Medgar Evers its first field secretary for the state of Mississippi. He was 31 years old, and he had just accepted what may have been the most dangerous job in America. The job meant crisscrossing Mississippi to investigate the violence that the rest of the country preferred not to see, to sign up members, to build local NAACP branches in towns where joining could get a person fired, evicted, or killed, and to push, always, on the single most explosive issue in the state, the right of black Mississippians to vote. In 1955, he threw himself into the investigation of the murder of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old boy from Chicago tortured and killed in the Mississippi Delta for supposedly offending a white woman. Evers, sometimes disguised as a sharecropper, helped find witnesses and move them to safety so the story could reach the outside world. He worked the killing of the Reverend George Lee and the shooting of the activist Gus Courts, and he pressed the case of Clyde Kennard, a black veteran railroaded into prison for trying to enroll at a white college. He worked the biggest cases and the smallest ones with the same patience. He investigated killings and beatings that no local paper would print. He drove witnesses across county lines in the dark. He kept files. And in 1962, he threw the weight of the Mississippi NAACP behind James Meredith, the Air Force veteran who was trying to become the first black student to enroll at the University of Mississippi. Meredith's admission, forced through at last by federal courts and federal marshals, set off a night of rioting on the Ole Miss campus that left 2 men dead and required thousands of troops to quell. Evers had helped open a door that the entire power structure of the state had thrown itself against, and everyone in Mississippi now knew his name. It matters in telling his story to be clear about the kind of man he was, because the myth can flatten him into a statue. Medgar Evers was not a fiery orator or a reckless hothead. He was measured, methodical, almost businesslike, a former insurance man who believed in files and facts and the slow accretion of registered voters and functioning local branches. He believed the law could be made to mean what it said. He worked in the open, under his own name, without bodyguards, in a state that had told him plainly it wanted him dead, because he thought the alternative, leaving or going silent, was worse. And he did not do it alone. Murley was his partner in the fullest sense, typing his reports, tracking the threats, raising 3 small children in a house where the family rehearsed, like a drill, what to do when the shooting came. For this work, Medgar Evers became one of the most hated and most watched black men in Mississippi. The white citizens' councils, the so-called respectable face of segregation, marked him. The Ku Klux Klan and its offshoots, the terror wing of the same cause, marked him. His telephone rang with threats. Cars followed him. He taught Murley and the children how to fall to the floor at the sound of a car in the driveway, how to stay away from the windows, what to do if the shooting started. He knew exactly what he had made of himself, a target, and he kept going. By the spring of 1963, Mississippi was a state under pressure, and Jackson was its fault line. Evers helped lead a campaign of boycotts, pickets, and sit-ins against the segregated stores and institutions of the capital, demanding an end to whites-only lunch counters, the hiring of black police and clerks, the desegregation of public facilities. The response was mass arrests, beatings, and a rising fury among the segregationists who saw their entire world being challenged by the quiet, relentless man from the NAACP. The confrontation reached its peak on the 28th of May, 1963. That day, 3 demonstrators, 2 black students from Tougaloo College and a white professor among them, sat down at the whites-only lunch counter of the Woolworth store in downtown Jackson and asked to be served. A jeering white crowd gathered and grew violent, smearing the protesters with ketchup, mustard, and sugar, pouring drinks over their heads, dragging one from his stool while the demonstrators sat and did not strike back. Photographs of that sit-in went around the world, and that same day, as if in answer, someone firebombed Medgar Evers' home. The 2 events, the public defiance and the private threat, arrived together, and Evers understood exactly what the second one meant. For the next 2 weeks, Jackson was a city on the edge. Hundreds of young people, some of them schoolchildren, marched and were arrested and packed into a makeshift stockade at the state fairgrounds. Evers moved through it all as the strategist and the steady hand, raising bail, calming tempers, keeping the boycott of downtown stores tight, and carrying, everywhere he went, the knowledge that he was the man his enemies most wanted gone. The near misses were piling up, the firebomb, a car that swerved at him outside the office. He told those close to him more than once that he might not live to see the change he was working for, and that this did not frighten him as much as the thought of stopping. The threats against Evers turned into attempts. On the 28th of May, 1963, someone threw a firebomb into the carport of his home. Days later, a car tried to run him down outside the NAACP office in Jackson. He told friends, and he told Murley, that he did not expect to live long. He said that if he died, it would be for something he believed in, and that a person who was not willing to die for what they believed in did not really believe in it at all. He kept a rifle in the house, kept the porch light burning, and kept working. On the evening of the 11th of June, 1963, President John F. Kennedy went on national television and for the first time framed civil rights not as a legal question but as a moral one, a matter, he said, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. Medgar Evers heard that speech. A few hours later, in the small hours of the 12th of June, he came home from a movement meeting, stepped out of his car with his stack of Jim Crow Must Go t-shirts, and was shot in the back from the darkness of a honeysuckle thicket across the street. He pulled himself toward the door. Murley and the children, who had been allowed to stay up to hear the president, ran out to find him. He died about 50 minutes later at a nearby hospital, the first black man ever admitted to its whites-only facilities. He was 3 weeks short of his 38th birthday. The hour that followed was as cruel as the crime. Murley and the 3 children had been allowed to stay up late to hear the president. When the shot rang out, they ran to the door and found him fallen on the concrete, still holding on to life and to his stack of T-shirts. Neighbors came running, lifted him onto a mattress, and rushed him to the hospital. There, at first, he was refused, the wrong color for its wards, until someone said who he was, and he was carried inside to become the first black patient those whites-only rooms had ever held. It was not enough. He died within the hour. The children had seen it. Murley had held him. And a movement that had lost a quiet field secretary discovered, overnight, that it had gained a martyr whose name the whole country would now learn. Medgar Evers was buried on the 19th of June, 1963, at Arlington National Cemetery, with full military honors owed to the soldier who had landed at Normandy. More than 3,000 people came. In Jackson, thousands more had marched behind his coffin. After the service, the grief boiled over. A crowd surged toward the police lines, bottles flew, and for a few minutes the city stood on the brink of a bloodbath, until a Justice Department lawyer named John Doerr walked, alone and unarmed, into the space between the two sides, said his own name aloud, and talked the crowd back from the edge. It was exactly the kind of catastrophe Evers had spent his life trying to prevent, and it was averted that day in his name. His death did what his enemies least wanted. It made him, in death, a national symbol of the movement he had served in near anonymity in life. President Kennedy received Murley Evers and her children at the White House. 2 months later, at the March on Washington, the folk singer Bob Dylan performed a song he had written about the killing, only a pawn in their game, which turned its gaze past the triggerman to the whole machine of Southern politics and poverty that had loaded the rifle. And the murder gave a terrible urgency to the civil rights bill that Kennedy had announced the very night Evers was shot. The bill that passed after Kennedy's own assassination would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The following summer, hundreds of student volunteers poured into Mississippi for the voter registration campaign that came to be called Freedom Summer, the mass movement to do openly and enforce the very thing Medgar Evers had been doing alone and quietly for nearly a decade. That summer, too, brought its dead the 3 young civil rights workers murdered near Philadelphia, Mississippi. The state Evers had tried to change did not surrender its old ways easily or quickly, but the direction had turned, and the current he had spent his life pushing against had, at last, begun to run the other way. Within days, the police arrested a fertilizer salesman and ardent segregationist named Byron Beckwith, a member of the White Citizens Council who would later be tied to the Ku Klux Klan. His fingerprint was on the telescopic sight of the rifle found in the thicket. But this was Mississippi in 1964. Twice that year, Beckwith was tried, and twice all-white, all-male juries failed to reach a verdict, deadlocking as the sitting segregationist governor, Ross Barnett, walked into the courtroom to shake the defendant's hand in front of the jury. Beckwith went free, and for years he all but boasted of what he had done. For Beckwith, going free was not enough. He wanted to be celebrated for it. In 1967, he ran for lieutenant governor of Mississippi and drew tens of thousands of votes. He gave winking speeches to sympathetic audiences. He was for years a free man in the state where he had killed Medgar Evers, protected by the same machinery that had let him walk. Murley Evers, unable to bear raising her children in that place, moved them to California. But she did not let go. In 1967, she published a memoir of their life together, For Us the Living, to keep his name and his story from fading, and she waited and she watched for the case to be reopened. Murley Evers refused to let it end there. For 3 decades, she kept the case alive, holding on to the transcripts and the evidence, pressing prosecutors, insisting that the file be reopened. In the early 1990s, new witnesses came forward who had heard Beckwith brag about the murder over the years, and long-buried records of jury tampering by a state segregation agency surfaced. In 1994, 31 years after the shot in the driveway, Byron Beckwith was tried a 3rd time now before a jury of black and white Mississippians, and on the 5th of February he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2001. The verdict came too late to give Medgar Evers back his life, but it broke at last the old Mississippi promise that a black man could be killed for his beliefs and no one would ever answer for it. The story did not stop with the verdict. Merle Evers Williams went on to chair the national board of the NAACP and, in 2013, delivered the invocation at a presidential inauguration, the widow of a murdered Mississippi field secretary standing before the whole nation. Medgar's brother, Charles Evers, became, in 1969, the first black mayor elected in Mississippi since Reconstruction. The Evers home in Jackson, where the blood dried on the driveway, is now a national monument of the United States. And in 2024, more than 60 years after a rifle shot in the dark, Medgar Wiley Evers was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. His name spread outward across the country he had believed in against so much evidence. In 1969, the City University of New York opened Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn. Streets and schools and a Navy ship were named for him. Mississippi, the state that had killed him and then for 30 years shielded his killer, put his statue on a college campus and turned his house into a shrine. None of it was inevitable. All of it grew from the work of a man who signed people up to vote in the most dangerous state in America, and from a widow who refused for 3 decades to let his murder be forgotten.
Look at him one last time. Not the martyr on the memorial, and not the name on the school and the boulevard, but the man himself, the boy who walked 12 miles to a broken-down schoolhouse and past a lynched man's bloody clothes, the soldier who fought for a country that segregated him, the insurance salesman who drove the back roads of the most dangerous state in America, signing people up to vote, knowing that each name might cost him his life. He was not famous while he lived. He worked in the open, without a bodyguard, in a place that had promised to kill him, because he believed that Mississippi could be something other than what it was. They shot him in his own driveway to prove him wrong. Everything that has happened since has proved him right.